Yo, I'm gonna have so much to edit. It's okay. It's all good. It's all good. Okay, let's try this again. Hey guys, welcome to my channel. My name is Tara and this is not working. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. Welcome to my channel. This is True Crime Matters with Tara. For those of you who don't know me, I am a mom first and I'm a woman of a few hats. I am a video editor, I'm a writer, I'm a photographer, and I have a full-time job. So today I'm super excited because I'm finally taking the leap into recording my very first episode of my channel for a 3-part series. This one was really hard for me. It took me probably 3 weeks just to read everything and investigate everything. But one of the things I have always been completely fascinated with was true crime. I mean, so many of us are. But it's also something I happen to have a very unique perspective on. And one of the reasons is because I majored in broadcast journalism. But the other reason is because when I was a little girl, my family became the focus of a national true crime story. And this was the early 90s. I mean, so it was around the time that media started to realize the level of money and power that was really behind reporting on true crime. So I do have the unique perspective of being followed by paparazzi and reading stories about my family in the newspaper and watching the news and seeing that. I mean, we even had Oprah and Phil Donahue calling up. And I remember when I was a little girl, you would just, who is it? Reporter, goodbye, no comment. More on that in a later episode. But the fact is that experience really changed me and it shaped me into who I became. And when it was time for me to go to college, I mean, I always knew I wanted to do film. So I decided to minor in film and that my major would actually be journalism, specifically broadcast journalism, because I wanted to learn to write for broadcasting. Now, just a precursor, for many of these cases that I cover, because of my unique personal experience being the child of a prisoner, I know it's going to bother some people that I seem to be sympathizing with the perpetrator. But I want to make very clear from the start that my intent is not just pure sympathy for the sake of sympathy for these people, but it's rather to help gather more data, to help victims in a more substantial sort of way. Because I believe if we're not looking at these situations from all sides equally, it barely helps us to scratch the surface to see what's really going on. That's what we're going to talk about on my channel. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, please subscribe. I'd be super thankful. Now, that being said, it really wasn't hard for me to pick the first case that I wanted to cover, although I knew this was going to be an absolute beast of a case to cover. However, this case is one of the most famous cases in US history, actually world history. One of the unique things about this case is that it was an absolute media circus from the start, and that wasn't by an accident. I personally believe that greed was at the very heart of why this case got as famous as it got. And what I mean by that is back in the early 90s, the landscape of TV was shifting into the 24-hour news cycle. And if you look back since the 80s, I mean, we had Unsolved Mysteries, Rescue 911, so executives really saw the huge success of those series. And that program really proved that viewers really got sucked into these mysterious true stories. So basically everyone that worked in TV and film, I mean, they were really realizing this formula. And the formula was be the first to catch this piece of information about this true crime story and catch a bigger audience, or rather enjoy the tastiest advertising income increase. And sure enough, mid-90s, you see the absolute frenzy of the O.J. Simpson trial. I mean, of course, he was a celebrity, so that would blow up. But while the O.J. Simpson case revolved around a celebrity, this case we're going to discuss did not involve any celebrities at all. In fact, this case was 2002, and it was just regular families going through a horrific crisis. But right around this time, most TV programming was the genre of reality television. Gone were the days of sitcoms or dramas, and that more creative programming was being replaced with reality shows like The Bachelor, Big Brother, Survivor, Trading Places. So this reality TV programming was beginning to really take over American television. So in a sense, the conditions were really perfect to generate this sort of reality TV meets true crime. So since this case is one of the most famous trials in US history, let me ask you, what do you know about the Scott Peterson case? Because I will tell you, I mean, before I dove into all of this, I thought I knew what happened, and I thought he was convicted for the crime he was accused of, and he did it. But I really just assumed, based on all the media coverage I saw, I mean, the case wasn't televised, and I had forgotten that. I actually thought that it was, and I had seen all of this evidence. However, at the very moment that I'm filming this, Scott Peterson's conviction is currently being re-examined by a Supreme Court judge due to the question of jury misconduct. So as it stands at this moment, there is a 50% chance that this infamous case will be tried again. In fact, many legal analysts believe that he really does have a fair shot of getting a new trial. And interestingly, in more recent years, more and more people have begun really changing their minds about what they think about the Scott Peterson case. It actually has many people, myself included, questioning if the right person was really convicted for this crime, or was this a really botched case? So with that, let's dive right into the case of the people versus Scott Lee Peterson. Scott Lee Peterson was born October 24th, 1972 in California to Lee Peterson and Jackie Latham. His father owned a crate packaging business while his mother owned a cute little boutique. While he is the only child of his parents, both of his parents were married before and had 6 children from previous marriages. One interesting thing to note is that Scott's grandfather was also actually murdered. Now, it was way before Scott was born, but Scott's mother, Jackie, went through some major trauma of her own as a child. Jackie lived in an orphanage with nuns most of her life after her father was murdered on the street by a former disgruntled employee. That's why when Jackie grew up and finally had a family of her own, she made very sure to sort of make sure that the home was happy, calm, and a stable place for her children to grow up. By all accounts, Scott was a really normal child growing up. He was in Cub Scouts, Little League, and he spent lots of weekends playing golf and going fishing with his family. Even as a young child, Scott was described as being very stoic, quiet, polite, and he was actually the child that was chosen by teachers to be a crossing guard because he was just so trustworthy. And as he got older, that behavior continued. Scott was actually tutoring homeless people when he was in high school, which is a really nice thing to do. Growing up, one thing that Scott really excelled at was golf. By age 14, Scott was a better golfer than his own dad, and he was hitting par by age 16. Scott began playing on the high school varsity team after school. And Scott's golf coach described Scott as being far more respectful and calmer than most of the boys his age. He said that while some kids would hit a bad shot and react loudly, throwing their clubs around, Scott would always just keep his calm. And this coach said he never really saw Scott get out of control. One odd thing that was reported, though, is one of Scott's first girlfriends said that Scott got her something for Valentine's Day, but then her heart was broken very soon after she realized that Scott got the same thing for another girl. So she was kind of shocked with that. But by all other accounts, Scott was a great guy. In college, professors would describe him as being the absolute perfect student. By the time Scott graduated from University San Diego High School in 1990, he was one of the top junior golfers in San Diego. He actually earned a partial golf scholarship to Arizona State University. And professional golfer Phil Mickelson was his classmate in school and college until Peterson actually got kicked off the team for giving Chris Couch, another golfer, a hangover after a night of partying. I don't know how Scott could be responsible for somebody else's hangover, but okay. So Scott transferred to California Polytechnic State University to major in international business. However, he later changed his major to agricultural business and completed his BS degree in June 1998. Now, Scott was always a hard worker. Not only did he always work at his parents' businesses during summer breaks as a kid, but even in college, he juggled 3 jobs. He worked as a waiter at a restaurant, but he also worked at 2 local golf courses. In fact, Scott was working as a waiter in the Pacific Cafe when a woman came in with a big smile and caught his attention. As they got to talking, they realized they were fellow Cal Poly students. The woman explained that she was majoring in ornamental horticulture. Scott was immediately smitten by this mystery woman. And this mystery woman was none other than Laci Denise Rocha. Now, Laci was born May 4th, 1975 to Sharon and Dennis Robert Rocha, a dairy operator, and they had met in high school. They owned a dairy farm in California. Laci had an older brother, Brent. Now, Laci was your classic farm girl. She didn't mind getting her hands dirty, and she was used to doing work outside since she had worked in the family farm from such a young age. Laci also fully enjoyed gardening with her mother, which was the very start of her appreciation for plant life that influenced her choice of major in college. Laci's parents, Sharon and Dennis, divorced when Laci and her brother were young kids. Now, Laci's mom, Sharon, took her children and moved to Modesto, California. Sharon eventually met and married a man by the name of Ron Gratzky, who helped raise Laci and Brent from when the time Laci was just 2 years old. Growing up, Laci had a huge heart and love for animals and plants. As a child, she would often cry during movies, and so much so that Laci's mom had to pre-scan movies or just know that movie before had made Laci really upset and not let her watch it, because she just had a big heart and get very upset during movies. As she grew older, her teenage years were described as that of an all-American girl. Her mother has described her as also being your classic Taurus. And her stepfather lovingly has described Laci as being the most stubborn person he had ever met. So Laci was a very headstrong person. And once she made her mind up about something, she wasn't turning back on it. There was no changing Laci's mind. Laci was a cheerleader in junior high school and high school. So by all accounts, she was a very vivacious, friendly, talkative, outgoing woman with a big, bright, beautiful smile. After graduating from high school, she attended California Polytechnic State University, where she majored in ornamental horticulture. Now, while at California Polytechnic, Laci would sometimes visit a friend who worked at a restaurant in Morro Bay called Pacific Cafe, and there she met her friend's co-worker, Scott Peterson. Laci was immediately attracted to Scott, and it was actually her that made the first move. After seeing him in the restaurant, she gave her friend her phone number to give to Scott, and Scott actually threw the phone number in the garbage, thinking that it was all a joke and the girls were kind of playing a joke on him. But now, if that would have happened to me, I would have been like, oh, he doesn't like me, and I would have moved on. I would have thought he was throwing out my number because he was embarrassed and didn't want to date me. But nope, not Laci. Nope, she was determined. She wrote her number down again and approached him again and said, nope, this is my number, and you must have thrown it out by accident. And that just goes to show how confident this woman was. Immediately after talking some more, they realized they had actually met at a party quite recently at Cal Poly, and it was said immediately after meeting him that she told her mother that this would be the man that she would marry. At the start of dating, things didn't really go smoothly for them. I mean, Laci was really not interested in his passions of fishing and golfing. In fact, the first date they went on was deep sea fishing, and Laci got extremely ill. But still, they managed to develop a deep connection after that. And as Laci's relationship with Scott grew more serious, Scott actually put aside his dreams of professional golfing in order to focus on a business path so they could start a family. After 2 years of dating, they began living together, and after Laci completed her graduation in 1997, they got married. So from the outside looking in, Scott and Laci looked like the perfect newlyweds. However, it's this point in the timeline that one starts to actually see a pattern of one major flaw in Scott's character. It was reported that Laci had found out that Scott was having an affair with another woman, Janet. And this woman actually walked in on Scott and Laci sleeping in bed. It's Scott's house that he had with college friends. And she started shouting at both of them. And this woke up one of Scott's roommates, who had to then escort this woman, Janet, out of the home. And he had to explain to this woman, look, that's Scott's wife. Uh-oh, not good. Now, as shocking as that incident was, Laci did not leave Scott. Although it was said that Laci was noticeably ignoring Scott at a dinner, later that night with another couple, a friend later recalled that Laci had expressed concern over the fact that Scott was unfaithful so early in the marriage, but she didn't leave him. So sources close to Laci said that she was aware of him having at least one affair before, during their marriage, but they said that she didn't talk about it much. It almost seemed like she knew what was going on, but she would rather not know more about it. I guess maybe she figured that Scott was the perfect husband otherwise, so if there had to be something wrong, Maybe that infidelity issue, apparently it wasn't that big of a deal, so she didn't want to think about it. I don't know. Now, right after they got married, Scott and Laci opened a sports bar called The Shack. And the restaurant actually did pretty well. It began attracting a decent number of customers, especially on weekends. But unfortunately, they had to sell the restaurant in 2000 when they decided to move closer to Laci's family in Modesto. Apparently, Laci's grandmother was sick, so Laci wanted to move closer to there in order to start a family, and Scott definitely agreed, and so they both moved to Modesto, California. So the Petersons purchased a 3-bedroom and 2-bathroom bungalow on Covina Avenue. And Laci began juggling a part-time substitute teaching job and trying to be the perfect homemaker and housewife. Meanwhile, with the help of one of his professors, Scott got a job with Tradecore USA, which was a Spanish fertilizer company. The couple, looking for their outlet of love of cooking after selling the restaurant, would often, host dinner parties with their family and friends and have people over by the pool, neighbors, all kinds of fun at their house. They just really enjoyed cooking and being around family and friends. So aside from what seemed to be hints of infidelity going on with Scott, on the outside, all seemed to be going really well for the couple. Now at this point, Scott and Laci had been married for several years, so it seemed like the perfect time to start a family. But the couple didn't get pregnant right away, though they had tried for quite a while. Laci's doctor said that Scott and Laci were using an ovulation calculator to conceive for years, and that Laci often had to call Scott to come home whenever it was time to try, and he would do that. The attempts to conceive would continue for nearly 2 years, when finally in May 2002, Laci and Scott announced that they were pregnant, and Laci was given a due date of February 10th, 2003. After the pregnancy was announced, friends and family said that Scott worked hard to help Laci convert the bedroom to a nursery to help the baby have the perfect room. This friend also said that Scott was really excited about having a baby. In fact, some people even said it was most of what Scott talked about in the beginning. It was also said that Scott was a really active partner for Laci. Always, he went to all of her Lamaze classes and was right by her side for every scan, despite the fact that he did have to travel a lot for work. And by all accounts, Scott was really extremely supportive husband. But here's where things start to get exceedingly shady with Scott. About 6 months into Laci's pregnancy, Scott attended a convention with his company with some co-workers, and it was there he met a woman by the name of Sean. That night, Scott went to dinner with some of his male co-workers, and this new woman friend, Sean, joined them. And while at dinner, Scott began complaining to Sean that he had all of these one-night stands, but they were all bimbos with no brains. So he was looking for someone single and intelligent. Well, Sean was engaged, so Scott asked her if she had any female friends that she could hook him up with. And since this woman, Sean, really believed that Scott was being sincere, she gave Scott the phone number of her friend. She was a single mom massage therapist called Amber Frey. Now, around the same time, Laci, 6 months pregnant, she was getting really concerned about weight gain, so she would go on long walks with her dog, Mackenzie. Sometimes Scott would go with her on these walks, and sometimes he wouldn't. Now, in early November, Laci called her doctor to report that she was getting dizzy while taking these walks. She would get lightheaded and feel like she's gonna pass out, so her doctor recommended to either exercise later in the day or exercise after eating and hydrating. But just 2 days after her initial complaint to the doctor, she called back again to report the same thing had happened. So it was kind of clear that Laci was just walking anyway, despite being concerned about passing out. Speaking of getting uncomfortable on the walks, Laci had been getting increasingly uncomfortable because of the homeless problem in the park where she would walk. Something I think is extremely important to note in this case is that the town of Modesto really wasn't the safest town. The town had an increasing crime rate as meth was becoming more and more of a huge problem there. The park actually had a section of homeless tents or encampments that were set up. That being said, despite the fact that Laci was fearful, Laci was also known in the neighborhood to get into altercations with the homeless, especially when they would wander into the neighborhood section out of the park. And on one occasion, Laci was outside videotaping. A neighbor who happened to be a Supreme Court judge actually lived on the same street and warned Laci that it really wasn't the best thing to do for the purposes of safety. But Laci was known again to be a fairly headstrong person, and she was just gonna do what she thought was the right thing to do, despite you know, anything else just because she felt like she's protecting her neighborhood. Now, November 20th, Scott told Laci he had to go away on business to a trip to Fresno, California, which was fairly common for Scott to do because Scott traveled for work. So while Scott did that, Laci went to her friend's house to watch The Bachelor while Scott headed to Fresno. But Scott wasn't just getting busy with work. See, Scott, the day prior, had made first date arrangements to meet the single mom, Amber, who he was set up with through that female friend, Sean, that he had met. So for their first date, you know, before sitting down at a restaurant for dinner, before, you know, grabbing a coffee with somebody new, Scott was just like, hey, you know, I have to take a shower. Would you mind just coming up to my room and... Makes sense. So Amber thought this sounded completely normal. So she goes up there and he has in his book bag, whatever a guy has in their book bag to get changed after a work meeting, which is, you know, a bottle of champagne or, you know, a box of strawberries. Somehow this worked on Amber. Apparently they slept together at the hotel before heading out to a burger joint for their real date. It was on this very first date that Scott told Amber how busy he was going to be in the upcoming months, where he was going on a fishing or a hunting trip to Alaska for Thanksgiving, and he was going on a trip to Maine for Christmas, and then he was going to Europe after New Year's to be there for a month. So he was a busy guy. He was making her well aware of all of his plans through January. And apparently for Amber, she didn't notice anything weird about this. It didn't seem weird that this man was making himself completely unavailable for every major holiday of the year. But of course what Scott was doing was building this relationship on a foundation of huge lies. Because in reality, of course Scott had plans with Laci for Thanksgiving and for Christmas and New Year's. So he told Amber he wouldn't be available. Apparently the rest of their first date was stellar because they wound up staying in the hotel again that night. Now, Amber and Scott's friend Sean, the woman who introduced them, was actually babysitting that whole night at Amber's apartment. So just sitting there watching the clock like, is she coming home to see her daughter or what's going on here? And so she actually had to call Amber in the morning to be like, you know, hi, I have your daughter here and I have to go to work, so can you come back to, you know, be a mom? So apparently it went really well, and Amber did go back and got her daughter, so that's good. And Scott went and returned to Laci later that day. Now, in early December, Amber and Scott had a bit of a longer second date when Scott went away on another business trip to Fresno. And he actually did attend to real business during the day, but it was during this second date that Amber gave Scott the key to her apartment and then also had him pick up her 2-year-old daughter at daycare and then proceed to watch this daughter in her home after their second date. So, okay. However, just days after Scott and Amber had their second date, Sean, the woman who introduced them, had become aware through business friends that Scott actually was married, and she was furious. She immediately stepped outside her office and called Scott and left a message. Now, Scott, he called back about an hour later sobbing and saying that he was so sorry he had lied, but it was all too painful for him to discuss in detail. But during that phone call, Scott pleaded with Sean, like, please just let me tell her in my own way. Do not tell her. So Sean backed off and just trusted that Scott would tell Amber the truth. Now, something I discovered in my research that I thought was super interesting is the fact that around this time, Amber was actually spending a lot of time on the phone with a Fresno police detective, a friend of hers. Now, his name was Richard Bird, and it's not clear whether they were just in a casual dating relationship or it was a platonic sort of relationship, but either way, their phone calls were super long. I mean, I'm talking like an hour long. So it's possible at this point, and I'm curious if Amber was actually like talking about this guy to the detective, like almost like suspicious of him or of the stories he was telling. But either way, It could have been that she was just bragging about him, who knows? But either way, I thought it was interesting. After Scott's lie about being married was discovered by Sean, that same weekend, Scott went on a fishing trip with some friends on the San Francisco Bay. I guess maybe to ponder how he could muster up the strength to tell his mistress about his marriage. But it was after this weekend, fishing with friends, that Scott says he realized how much he really missed the fishing trips from his youth. So the very next day, on December 9th, Scott began to shop around for his own fishing boat, and computer searches show that he spent 30 seconds researching currents of the bay, the San Francisco Bay, before viewing several ads for boats on sale. He also looked up how to obtain a license. Scott would later say that he didn't tell his in-laws about the potential boat purchase because it was also meant to be part of his Christmas gift to them. Sure enough, 2 days after starting this initial boat research, Scott purchased a 14-foot aluminum boat for $1,400. This would be the fourth boat that Scott would own in his life, so a fairly common thing for him. Along with the purchase of this boat came life vests, seat cushions, an oar, and a few other spare items. However, the owner of the boat did not sell Scott his anchors. The seller stated that he wanted to keep these anchors for the next boat that he was about to buy. And Scott was okay with that, paid for the boat, and kept it moving. The same day he bought the boat, Scott had a sort of third date with Amber, and it was this date where he would tell Amber the truth about his marriage. However, Scott kept feeding Amber lies. Amber has said that Scott showed visible emotion and then continued to lie to her that, he had been married, but he lost his wife. And at the time, Amber didn't really ask for any more details about what he meant by loss, since Scott was visibly extremely upset. So she didn't want to ask more questions. She was uncomfortable to begin with. So she just assumed that maybe she had a heart attack or was in a car wreck and just didn't say anything else. But during that conversation, Amber did ask Scott where he really lived. And he lied and he said Sacramento. And she asked him if he also had a home in Modesto. And he lied again, said he did not. Now again, I'm wondering if the police detective maybe had some information and had given Amber that tip, but I don't know. Who knows? But Scott reiterated during that conversation again that he would be away on trips basically through the end of January, but that he would love to resume the relationship again and take it more seriously when he could return in February, basically. In fact, at this point, it really seems that Scott is really keeping Amber at a distance from his family and is really kind of telling her nothing but lies at this point. He's still reserving most of his time, obviously, for Laci at that point. Now, around this time in early December, Laci stopped working as a substitute teacher to prepare for her mid-February due date. She began watching Martha Stewart Living in the mornings and often waved to her neighbors as she walked by, walking Mackenzie to the hilly, woody park just a few blocks away. Also interesting to note is that in early December, Laci's grandmother passed away, and Laci inherited her grandmother's extravagant jewelry collection. In fact, 2 jewelers said that Laci came into their shop and they appraised Laci's inheritance in excess of $100,000. Before leaving, Laci actually asked the jewelers to incorporate 2 of her grandmother's rings into her own wedding ring. So Laci actually left her wedding ring at their shop. But oddly, immediately after getting appraisals of some extravagant jewelry, Laci also made 2 visits to a local Modesto pawn shop where she quickly pawned gold chains, charms, and other rings for just $250. Scott actually accompanied her on one of these trips at the pawn shop, and the owner remembers specifically that Scott was being affectionate and rubbing Laci's belly, and Laci was kind of pushing him off and annoyed by it. And it's still unclear to everyone why the couple was selling their jewelry in a pawn shop or pawning their jewelry instead of a venue where they were likely to get much more money. Now, we're in mid-December now, and as we all know, there's lots of family and friends gathering for holiday parties at this point, and Scott and Laci were supposed to attend a Christmas party together. However, at the last minute, Scott told Laci he had to meet a business colleague instead of attending a Christmas party with her. So Laci attended this Christmas party alone. In fact, Laci had told her mom that Scott couldn't be there because he had to go to San Francisco to meet somebody at his company. And Laci's mom was like, well, can't it wait until Monday? And Laci replied, no, Scott said the worker said it really has to be done now, so it couldn't wait. But this was all a lie because Scott was actually on his 6th date with Amber at that point, which also actually happened to be a formal holiday party. After the party, Amber told Scott that she was struggling as a single mom and she was really looking for a more serious relationship and she wanted more children. However, Scott replied that he really didn't want any more kids and, you know, her child was enough for him. After their separate holiday parties, Ron and Sharon had dinner over Scott and Laci's house. And much of that conversation now was about fishing. Now, even though Scott knew Ron was an avid fisherman and that he would love to have chatted about Scott's new purchase of his new boat, Scott never mentioned the boat at that dinner. And again, he says it was because it was sort of a Christmas surprise that he was going to talk about on Christmas morning with the family. In fact, Laci and Scott were planning to host a Christmas morning brunch at their house, which it is true that Ron would have been really excited about the purchase of a boat because to this day, Ron confirms that during that dinner, he did specifically tell Laci and Scott how much he would love to have his own boat. Now, on December 20th, Scott was getting this Christmas surprise boat ready for the Christmas display to Ron and the rest of the family, so he wanted to make sure everything would be ready to go in the water. This is when he started making the cement anchor for the boat. It was one cement anchor. And Scott's co-worker would say that he used the warehouse and he could confirm that he saw Scott building the cement anchor at the warehouse table, and that was there on December 20th. Later the very same day, on December 20th, Scott says that Laci popped in the warehouse and she wanted to say hello and see this new boat because she knew about the boat, he says. And while she was at the warehouse, Laci, about 8 months pregnant at the time, she really needed to use the restroom really badly. However, the restroom was blocked by stacks of fertilizer, so it really wasn't the best idea for her to use that restroom. So Laci had to go to the business owner at the next door warehouse and kind of ask if she could use the restroom at that point. Now, just 2 days later, on the afternoon of December 23rd, Laci got her nails done in the morning, and later in the afternoon, Laci and Scott met for a prenatal visit, and doctor said she was super excited and getting really ready for this baby to be coming. The evening of December 23rd, Scott and Laci went to the salon where Amy, Laci's half-sister, worked. And during the haircut, Amy mentioned that she had ordered a gift basket for their father. And while she had to work the next day, she would have to go and pick up the gift basket after her work. And she had to do that between noon and 3 o'clock. So Scott immediately volunteered to pick up this basket because he had in his head that he was going golfing the next day. So he volunteered that, hey, I'm gonna be there anyway, so I might as well just go pick up the basket for you guys. Since the farm was right near the golf course, it would be nothing for him to go get it and save Amy the trip since she was working and it was just such a pain. At the end of the haircut, Amy showed Laci how to do a specific flip with the curling iron in her hair and curl up her bangs. And as she finished, Amy began cutting Scott's hair. Now it was around 6:30 and Scott and Laci were getting kind of hungry, so they decided to order a pizza for dinner. And Laci asked her sister if she could use the salon phone to order a pizza because her phone was dead in the car. At that point, Scott actually asked Amy to join them for dinner at their house, but Amy declined because she had a friend that was visiting from out of town. At around 7, they were all finished up with their haircuts, so Scott and Laci said their goodbyes to Amy, and they said they would see each other at dinner the next day, which would be Christmas Eve dinner. Back in Scott and Laci's house, they had their pizza, and around 8:30, Laci called her mom from the landline in the home. And Laci and her mom quickly confirmed timing for Christmas Eve dinner plans. Scott says that after Laci finished talking to her mom, they continued to watch football and then watch the movie The Rookie. Scott estimated that they went to bed at about 10:30, and Laci wore his blue pajama pants to bed since she was pregnant and she didn't really fit into any pajama pants of her own. The next morning was Christmas Eve, and Scott said he woke up at 8 a.m. and Laci was already up. Scott estimated that Laci woke up at about 7 a.m. since he was hearing her showering and moving around the house and grabbing herself breakfast. And Scott says that Laci really needed to eat breakfast right away when she woke up because she would get nauseous from morning sickness and pregnancy. As Scott got out of bed, he said he noticed that Laci was already showered and dressed, and she had on black pants and a white long-sleeved top, and she was barefoot. He says that he showered and he grabbed a bowl of cereal. And as he ate, Laci was hungry again after she had eaten a bowl of cereal earlier, but she had made herself a piece of toast and she was munching on that. Laci then began telling Scott about her preparations for their family brunch the next day. And she said first that she was planning on taking the dog Mackenzie out for a walk, and then she was planning on going shopping, picking up some ingredients to make gingerbread cookies and cordon bleu French toast. And as Scott ate, he noticed that Laci had on her favorite TV show, which was Martha Stewart Living. And Scott specifically remembers that Martha was discussing making cookies with meringue. And as he finished up his breakfast, Laci reminded Scott to be home by 4 o'clock because they were going to go to her parents' house for dinner, for Christmas Eve dinner. After he finished eating, Scott went outside of the backyard and grabbed some pool umbrellas that had been out there, and he was going to put them in his warehouse for storage because it was said that previous years he would just grab them and put them in storage for the winter months because, I mean, at this point, it was winter at that time in California. It really was not pool weather, and really the umbrella should have been put there months ago. So he said since they were having company over, he wanted to kind of put them away and get them where they belonged in the warehouse. So Scott went out to the shed because these were white umbrellas, and he always had fertilizer in the back of his truck, so he didn't want to ruin the umbrellas. So he wrapped the umbrellas in a tarp, put them into the back of the truck, and it was then when he was loading these umbrellas in the back of the truck that the neighbor saw Scott loading these umbrellas and waved to Scott, and they both kind of waved hello to each other. And what that neighbor also says she notices as she was waving is she saw a strange older van that was parked right outside of the street across from Scott and Laci's home. And it was a van she had never really seen in the neighborhood before. At this point in the morning, Scott said that he noticed the weather really wasn't ideal for golfing. Apparently, slight things like wind and the temperature can really affect the entire sport of golf. You know, just because, you know, you can't wear these big, heavy, bulky jackets when you're trying to swing. And as somebody who is almost a pro golfer, like, I could see that you're taking that seriously. So Scott decided, you know, it's not really the best day to go golfing because I can't bundle up, so might as well bundle up and go fishing. Plus, Scott said, you know, he was getting really excited to tell everybody about the boat purchase, so he wanted to just like get the boat in the water, and he wanted to really like use his new toy to scope out the bay before showing Laci's family on Christmas. Just before he left for the day, Laci had asked Scott to fill up the mop bucket. Apparently, even though she had just had the cleaning lady over the day before, Laci was getting kind of like extra clean about Christmas Eve dinner, and apparently that day it was really muddy, so the dog Mackenzie, every time he would come in from outside, kept bringing little pieces of mud all over the floor. So I guess Laci, in hoping to keep the rest of the house clean, was trying to kind of nip it in the bud and, you know, mop it. And I can honestly see that because I am like that sometimes. And Scott said he kind of, you know, filled up the bucket for her, said their goodbyes, and he left at 9:30 in the morning. Now, Scott said he got to his warehouse where the boat was and was on his computer at 10:30 in the morning till about 11 o'clock in the morning, and he wanted to just send some holiday emails. And he got this new tool where he wanted to actually go to the website and download the directions on how to put together the tool. It was a mortiser. I don't really know what that is, but apparently he just purchased it on eBay a few days prior, so he was excited about putting it together. So he got those directions out and he started to piece it together. And after he did that is when he opened up the large roll-up door to the warehouse and unloaded some tools from the toolbox in his truck. And while he unloaded those tools is when he actually cut his knuckle and he started to bleed. It was just a little bit of blood, but it was on the driver's side door there. Scott then decided to leave to go fishing and to test out his new boat. Scott then left the warehouse and drove to Berkeley Marina and purchased a boat launch ticket at 12:54 p.m. And Scott said it was Christmas Eve. There was a bunch of people like outside on Christmas Eve there, and he decided to just get the boat in the water and kind of drove it towards Brooks Island. And he said he saw a sign that said no landing, and there was some broken piers there and really not much to look at. And he said that at that point he realized he had forgotten some lures that he purchased and he left them on the truck. So he just used some freshwater jigs from his tackle box that he had in the boat and just trolled for a bit and then quickly headed back to the marina because it was getting pretty late. And also he says he was getting pretty wet because it was starting to rain in the water, so now he was kind of like soaking wet and smelly. Now when Scott arrived back at the marina, he said he talked to a couple of guys about fishing and that a couple of maintenance guys were getting a really good laugh at him struggling to get down the ramp to load the boat again. On the way back to Modesto, Scott first called his voicemail at 2:12 to just check if he had any messages while he was out at the bay. And he didn't have any urgent messages, so he then immediately called Laci on the home telephone. And Scott knew that Laci's phone was kind of finicky and often dead and in her car, so he figured he'd most likely catch her on the landline. But the phone rang for over 2 minutes and Laci still wasn't picking up, so Scott immediately then calls her cell phone, thinking that maybe she was just out at the store. Laci didn't pick up her cell phone either, and now Scott was getting concerned because he was hitting Christmas Eve traffic on the way home, and he could already see that he was going to be a little bit later than 4 o'clock getting home. So he realized that he couldn't pick up that basket that he promised to pick up because he wasn't by the golf course. He went fishing that day, but he still had in his head that, oh my gosh, I'm gonna be late to pick up this basket, so I hope I can catch Laci because I don't wanna bother, you know, her sister. She's in the middle of work right now, so he was hoping to catch her to pick up that basket. So then Scott left this famous message on Laci's voicemail.
Hey, beautiful. I just left a message at home. 2:15. I live in Berkeley. I won't be able to get to Villa Farms to get that basket for Papa. I was hoping you would get this message and go on out there. I'll see you in a bit, sweetie. Love you. Bye.
End of message.
On his drive home, Scott also called his good friend Greg to solidify their New Year's Eve plans with their wives, and then he called his dad to talk for a bit. When Scott got off the phone with his dad, he called Laci a third time on the home phone at 3:52, and he still got no answer. And so Scott arrived back at the warehouse, unhooked his boat, and then headed back home. Scott estimated that he finally got home between 4:30 and 4:45, and immediately noticed that Laci's car was still sitting in the driveway, but the lights were off in the house. So he initially assumed that Laci must have gotten picked up from her mom Sharon, and they must have, you know, spent the day together prepping for Christmas Eve dinner. So Scott got out of his car and entered through the backyard through the side gate, and when he did, their dog Mackenzie greeted Scott, but oddly Mackenzie had his leash still attached to his collar. So Scott removed the leash and put it on the patio table. As Scott approached the back door, he emptied the mop bucket because it was still full of water, and he said that he was worried the cats would be drinking out of it, and he didn't want the cats to be drinking soapy mop water. So he poured it out and he grabbed the mail and headed inside. Now Scott says his clothes were still damp and really smelly from the bay, so he knew that Laci kept her house meticulously clean. So knowing that they were having Christmas Day brunch, he immediately took off his clothes and put them in the washer. And he said he pushed aside a bunch of dirty rags that were still lying on top of the washing machine that the maid had left there from the day before. So he threw his wet clothes in the washer, added soap, and turned on the washing machine. Now Scott would say this was a pretty common habit for him because he worked with chemicals all the time, so when he would come home from work, it was a thing where he would immediately take off his clothes and put them in the washer and turn it on. Plus, he knew that Laci was trying to keep the house smelling and looking fresh for the next day. Now at this point, Scott was absolutely starving because he hadn't eaten since breakfast, so he took out pizza from the night before, put the box in the middle of the counter, grabbed the slice of pizza, poured himself a glass of milk, and sort of ran into the shower with the cold pizza in his hand, just trying to take a shower and eat so he wasn't that late to get to Christmas Eve dinner. So Scott quickly showered, got dressed, and headed back into the kitchen to put away the pizza box and head out. And he said as he was walking into the kitchen, he noticed that there were messages blinking on the answering machine. So Scott played the messages, and on the messages he heard his own voicemail he had left from earlier when he realized he was going to be late. But then The second message was Laci's stepfather, Ron, asking if Scott and Laci could bring whipped cream when they came later. And this immediately confused Scott because it was a fairly recent phone call, first of all, that Ron had called, but second of all, it was indicated in that message that Laci was not already there preparing Christmas Eve dinner. So this was the message that prompted Scott to then immediately call Ron and Sharon's house, since at that point, he was worried. At 5:17, Scott called Laci's parents and asked Ron if Laci was there. And Ron replied that she was not. So Scott told them that he was confused because Laci's car was still in the driveway, but yet she was not home or there with them, and he knew he had been calling her since 2 o'clock and not getting any responses. So then Sharon got on the phone, and it's at this point where Scott actually says the words, "Laci is missing." And Sharon scoffed at that and said, you know, she's not missing, she's somewhere, we just have to get a hold of her. But Scott explained that he had been trying to call Laci since 2:15 and was getting no answer on any phone, plus her car was still on the driveway. Sharon then asked if Mackenzie was in the yard. It's then that Scott remembered, yes, Mackenzie was there, but the leash was still on. Now at this point, Laci's parents are concerned, and it was decided that they would call 911 while Scott would go door to door looking for Laci. That is all I have now for part 1, but part 2 will be coming shortly. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.